Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm the editor and the curator of the Dissenter Newsletter, and welcome to the inaugural show of the Dissenter Weekly. It's good to have you here. Thanks for tuning in. You might be receiving this show if you are paid subscribers of the Dissenter. If you are not a paid subscriber of the Dissenter, and then you're just seeing this show broadcast a few days after it was first posted. And so let me just take a moment to encourage you, if you are not already, to become a subscriber of the Dissenter. You can go to the dissenter.org and become a subscriber there. And you'll support the work that we do covering freedom of the press, attacks on journalists, whistleblower cases, retaliation against whistleblowers, for example, prosecutions under the Espionage Act, and also government secrecy. And so this show is a throwback in a way. I used to do a weekly show called the Dissenter Weekly when I had Shadowproof. I was the editor, a co-editor of Shadowproof Media Organization from 2015 to the end of 2023. And the newsletter, The Dissenter, grew out of that work at Shadowproof, doing regular coverage of secrecy, whistleblowers, and freedom of the press. And so, as Donald Trump takes office, as I have been in a transition, I moved away from a podcast that I had done for over 10 years. It was called the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. And some of you who are here may have listened or seen a few shows. Certainly, I was uploading videos of interviews with guests that were on the show to this YouTube channel. And so I have pared things back a little bit. I'm going to work on a tightly focused show that covers some of the big news every week related to the three key areas that I truly spend a lot of time digging into and writing about for the Dissenter Newsletter publication. And I'm hoping to connect with people like you out there who do care about these issues as we have President Donald Trump in office, or as we grapple with the legacy of President Joe Biden and what was left behind. If you were a reader of the Dissenter, you will know that over the last few months, I wrote a series on Biden's legacy that dug into the state of the press and the way in which the transparency was eroded by his government, the way Freedom of Information Act was left in shambles, the way in which we saw the state secrets privilege invoked to halt lawsuits against abuses of power by U.S. government agencies, usually involving surveillance or national security or military affairs, for example. And then also digging into what happened with whistleblowers while Joe Biden was president, and also looking at the world and how it became more unsafe for journalists while Biden was president through things like the prosecution of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, but also over 200 journalists are known to have been killed or massacred by the U.S. armed Israeli military forces during the war on Gaza. And so that's all a part of the most pressing issues, the most critical issues that are focused on and covered by the Dissenter. And I'm going to bring that work into this show. So that sets up the show, that lets you know a bit about what this is that you are seeing. It is a new thing, but the issues I'm talking about are not new at all. People who have tuned into my work will be very familiar, I think, with a lot of what gets discussed here. And as we go forward, there will likely be guests that are invited to come on and share what will be about a half hour, maybe a tad bit over a half hour every week. The show will be posted on Friday. It will be sent to those who are subscribed to it. Those who are paid subscribers, there's a lower tier for subscribing. Every week, there will be headlines that I read to start the show. These will be stories that I want to make sure are not missed, that I don't miss, that you don't miss. But I probably didn't have time to write them into articles and just publish them at the Dissenter. So this is the way to make sure that they aren't overlooked. The headlines for this week are that a U.S. court ruled that the NSA's backdoor searches violate constitutional rights to privacy. The ACLU called this decision a first of its kind ruling. The U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of New York ruled that warrantless searches under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, violate the Fourth Amendment right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution. According to the ACLU, the decision, quote, follows years of public revelations about how Section 702 has been used by the government to conduct warrantless surveillance of Americans, including protesters, members of Congress, and journalists. Trump fires all Democrats from Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Trump fired 3 of the 4 members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, also known as PCLOB, an independent watchdog agency that took on greater significance after NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden exposed the NSA's mass surveillance programs. The terminations mean that the board cannot function, and Democratic Senator Ron Wyden said, by purging the Democratic members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, Trump is kneecapping one of the only independent watchdogs over government surveillance who could alert Congress and the public about surveillance abuses by his administration. Trump reclassifies U.S. government employees as at-will employees. An executive order that partly reinstates a 2020 order, removes workplace protections for U.S. government employees, and jeopardizes the rights of potential whistleblowers. The Government Accountability Project, which is known for its work representing whistleblowers, argues that this further empowers Trump as he aims to replace, quote, federal employees of conscience with those more dedicated to party loyalty than the Constitution and the American people, end quote. Trump issues executive order for declassification of all remaining files on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, as well as files on the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. From the executive order, Donald Trump declared, I have now determined that the continued redaction and withholding of information from records pertaining to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy is not consistent with the public interest, and the release of these records is long overdue. And although no act of Congress directs the release of information pertaining to the assassinations of Senator Robert F. Kennedy and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I have determined that the release of all records in the federal government's possession pertaining to each of those assassinations is also in the public interest. Stanford University drops an administrative case against student journalists. Stanford administrators finally announced that it will not formally punish student journalist Dylan Gohill, who was arrested on June 5th, 2024, while covering a protest against Stanford's investments in companies which, quote, provide material and logistical support to Israel's current military campaign in Gaza. He was working for the university's newspaper, the Stanford Daily, and despite the fact that this has been withdrawn, the district attorney has not ruled out the possibility of charging Gohill. Portland independent journalist faces trial for reporting on pro-Palestine student protest. As reported by journalist Jen Byers for Prism, Portland independent journalist Alyssa Azar goes on trial on January 27th in Multnomah County, Oregon. She was arrested and charged with trespassing in May of 2024 while covering a student protest for Palestine at Portland State University. Azar claimed she was singled out by police, and as a result of a prior felony conviction in 2024, where she was unjustly prosecuted for defending herself when a member of the right-wing extremist group Proud Boys attacked her, she could face a significant sentence in prison if found guilty. Former CIA analyst pleaded guilty to Espionage Act charge. A former CIA analyst named Asif Rahman pleaded guilty to a violation of the Espionage Act on January 17th this year. Rahman was charged by the Justice Department under President Joe Biden back in November, and he was accused of disclosing information that showed Israel's preparations for an attack on Iran. The case is noteworthy because it represents the first time that the U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of Virginia sided with the U.S. government and ordered a defendant accused of an unauthorized disclosure to be held in pretrial detention. Of course, now he is going to face a potentially lengthy prison sentence. There will be more next week from Chip Gibbons, who is working on an article for the Dissenter. He's a guest contributor, somebody who has been covering this case for the Dissenter, and I hope to be able to bring him onto the show so that I can talk with him about the case, and also so he can share his reporting for the Dissenter. But he's working on a report that should be published on Monday, and it'll get into the guilty plea. He's been seeing some things that are remarkable about it, and how there are multiple leaks that he is implicated in, but they only charged the one that was related to the preparations that the Israeli government were taking to strike Iran. That does it for the headlines for this week. Let's get to the main story. The main story is Donald Trump and the threat that his administration poses to freedom of the press as well as whistleblowers. And I'll give you a flavor of what we can expect. It was already part of his campaign.
We will launch a major crackdown on government leakers who collude with the fake news to deliberately weave false narratives and to subvert our government and our democracy. When possible, we will press criminal charges.
And so Donald Trump is going to take action against those that are perceived as his political enemies. This isn't just something that is going to be repeated and said by people who are part of the quote unquote hashtag resistance. There are an unprecedented scope of threats, according to Reporters Without Borders, that have to be taken seriously. So in the same way that the Dissenter approached President Joe Biden's administration, going forward, the Dissenter will be doing tracking of Donald Trump's administration to dig into the different ways in which he could oppress and try and contain and undermine the ability of people who are journalists to do their jobs, and also to silence whistleblowers within government. None of the coverage that is done here is intended to say that this has never happened. None of the coverage that is done here is intended to say that this isn't something that a Democrat would do, but this is coverage that is necessary in order to document and chronicle the reality of a Trump administration. We will look at the arrests and detentions of journalists. So, for example, those cases that happen underneath Donald Trump, they may not just come from Donald Trump, but the way in which Donald Trump governs creates a climate that encourages these kinds of prosecutions. Presidents can encourage, or by virtue of being indifferent, basically allow through their apathy the prosecutions of people like Alyssa Azar, that case that was mentioned in the headlines. So we'll look at those examples if journalists are put on trial. We'll look at the removal or bans against journalists as it relates to their presence in press briefing rooms, possibly, or it could just have to do with the premises of being able to be in different government agency buildings to access events. Perhaps there will be journalists that are blacklisted. That will be a kind of important thing to follow. Subpoenas or other forms of legal action. There could be prior restraint. Usually that is imposed by courts, but what it would mean is that certain publication or media organization is restricted from publishing information. And if they do so, there'll be penalties. They could face criminal repercussions. Defamation or libel lawsuits is another area in which we will want to track but he doesn't really have to use that anymore because the Justice Department can be wielded against people who would be most likely the targets of his defamation or libel lawsuits if he was not president. So looking at those retaliatory prosecutions, to the extent that they're political, that might be brought into the way in which Donald Trump is covered through this show. We'll look at Espionage Act prosecutions to punish leaks, or if other criminal statutes are used to punish the unauthorized disclosure of information to the press. Gag orders against agency employees for the intent of preventing any communications with the press. We'll cover the free speech rights that employees should have within government. Forced resignations or workplace retaliation. Anytime we're seeing the weaponization of government against people who are persons of conscience. And then, of course, also as the government might be weaponized to silence journalists. And then in secrecy, in the realm of secrecy, the government can invoke the state secrets privilege to stop lawsuits. There will be a number of organizations that pursue action against various agencies for abuses of power, as there were those type of cases under Biden and under Donald Trump in his first term, and then also under President Barack Obama. And the state secrets privilege has consistently been invoked over the last 15 to 20 years to try and stop challenges to these abuses of power. There's the removal of data from government agency websites. So the wholesale censorship of material, the suppression of it, taking it away so that we do not have access to that material anymore, especially if it doesn't fit the partisan agenda of Donald Trump. And then secrecy abuses that undermine the Freedom of Information Act. And that can be dry and sometimes not really lend itself to this type of a show. And yet we need to follow it because the openness in government that is necessary for us to have truthful information so we can at least make a good faith attempt to hold our leaders accountable. That's something that we have to follow as well. And so as I think about Donald Trump and the range of threats, I personally am not as concerned about the access of a CNN correspondent to the White House briefing room, although I don't think journalists should be thrown out of those areas. But the people who are spokespeople for different agencies, let's say the State Department or the White House for some very prominent examples, they get paid to lie. They get paid to tell you the spin that has been fed to them about the administration that day or about that department for that day. And those reporters who are in that room know that they are trying to somehow extract a nugget that they can obtain so that they can have some kind of a thing to take to their editors. And it doesn't always work out. Sometimes they're just rebuffed as they try to get something close to or approaching the truth from these spokespeople. I view that as not really as important to speak out about as it is to defend the rights of journalists and the rights to be free from prosecution and retaliation, the rights to be able to exercise your First Amendment rights in the United States, globally, freedom of expression, the rights to not have the US government seek your extradition if you're an international correspondent, the right to not have the US endangering you as you are working. You could be in a conflict zone, you could be in a non-conflict zone. But the fact is that the US should not play any role in contributing to the risks that you might face as a journalist while you're doing your work, while you're doing your investigations, while you're trying to put together your reports. Engage in the standard news gathering practices that are engaged in daily by reporters. And so to me, that is what we need to focus upon. Those who get caught in the crosshairs, those who become figures that Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and there's a whole right wing media echo chamber. And you can see it on social media. You can see it in online spaces. And as they single out certain journalists and make them targets, sometimes those people might be elite journalists. And it might not seem like we really need to give them any solidarity or support. But on other times, there are going to be people who get singled out that are lacking resources, that do not have the benefit of legal departments at news media organizations to protect them. And so those people, especially like Elisa Azar, keep going back to that example. Those are the kinds of cases that I want to give the most attention on this show. So I will not be, spending time on Jim Acosta if he decides to revisit the White House briefing room and stand up and interrupt Donald Trump while he is trying to speak. And then Donald Trump threatens to have him ejected from the White House press briefing room. And then we get to see this whole theater play out before us. I don't think that that is the most substantial kind of representation of threats to our freedom. And so that probably won't play as much on this show as other stories. It's important to remind everyone that Donald Trump did have secret subpoenas. These secret subpoenas were issued against the Washington Post, against CNN, and against the New York Times. And those editors, those publications didn't know at first that they were being targeted for their journalism on Donald Trump and his administration. These secret subpoenas were then found later to have violated the news media policy that the Justice Department was supposed to be following. And it was a policy that was adopted in 2014 and 2015. And some of that policy stemmed from outrages that occurred while President Barack Obama was in office. These are incidents or matters that I covered early in my journalism career. I was covering James Rosen, Fox News reporter, who was singled out in a leak prosecution against a State Department employee named Stephen Kim. He was singled out as an aider, abettor of a leak, a co-conspirator as well. Those were the words in these official documents that were submitted as part of the case. And it signaled that he was potentially exposed to a criminal prosecution, but for the discretion of Justice Department officials under Attorney General Eric Holder, who elected to not go forward and issue a criminal charge against James Rosen when he was at Fox News. There's also the incident involving the sweeping up, the basically like the vacuuming up of records for dozens of phones, and they were at the Associated Press's newsroom. And this was part of a leak investigation as well. And that was a scandal. And both of those examples fueled a reconsidering of the way the Justice Department would handle the news media when it came to criminal investigations. And then these subpoenas, these secret subpoenas that were issued under Trump, they became known during the first year that Joe Biden was in office. And what we learned, in addition to Trump issuing the secret subpoenas, is that there were gag orders that accompanied these subpoenas. And so the editors were actually told that they could not speak about these subpoenas. And that continued while Biden was president. As they were publicized, there was some relenting. And then eventually Joe Biden flat out condemned the idea of these secret subpoenas against news media organizations. But I think that had a large part to do with the fact that we knew about the subpoenas. Now, it was not something that the Biden administration could publicly defend. And so that history should be kept in mind as we move forward in Donald Trump's second term, because part of the Project 2025 agenda, which has been adopted by his administration, there are people who authored parts of Project 2025 that have positions in his administration. And so he's serious about implementing this project that was developed, a blueprint for his second term developed by the Conservative Heritage Foundation. And by the way, this isn't the first time that the Heritage Foundation has had a blueprint that they developed, that when there was when their president got into office, they were able to hand it to them and have them implement it. This occurred in the 90s, and Newt Gingrich was basically, with the Contract for America, facilitating all of the wishes that the Heritage Foundation had for the United States. And so in this Project 2025, there's a lot that can be discussed, lots of dreams and lots of aspirations that the conservatives have in the United States. Part of the agenda is to go back to subpoenaing journalists, to not have restrictions against going after those who publish journalism about Donald Trump. Part of Project 2025 is adding more counterintelligence agents to the FBI to go after and target the reporters, and also this would accompany the unearthing of people who are engaged in whistleblowing in the federal government. Part of what they're doing too is seeking to ensure that all of the government employees maintain a kind of loyalty to Donald Trump while he is in office. And if they are found to be speaking to the press, they want to have the ability to terminate those employees from their position. And so some of the protections that are in place for federal government employees that would at least delay a kind of immediate retaliation of this magnitude, he would like to get rid of it. That's what we were talking about with the reclassification of employees. And so these are all different things to be mindful of. But then there's the whole media landscape itself. There's the elite press, there's the establishment news media, then there's the movement press, there's alternative media, and then of course there's the right-wing media echo chamber that has been built up and is going to basically act as a kind of megaphone for Donald Trump during his administration. And they probably don't have too much to fear. They probably won't find themselves being targeted necessarily, but those who are in the establishment news media, it's important to mention, have already begun the act of censoring themselves and obeying Donald Trump before he even was inaugurated. And so we need to get to, as we conclude, the fact that ABC News settled with Donald Trump for $15 million when they were hit with a defamation lawsuit. And that came in the weeks before Donald Trump took office. ABC News was sued by Trump because of the fact that George Stephanopoulos in March had asked Representative Nancy Mace, a Republican of South Carolina, who had spoken publicly about being raped as a teenager, why she had continued to support Mr. Trump after he was found, quote, liable for rape. And that liability came in a 2023 civil case in Manhattan. You might be familiar with this case. I'll save the details for another conversation. Fact is that several experts in media believe, according to the New York Times, that ABC News could have continued to fight, given the high threshold required by the courts for a public figure like Mr. Trump. A plaintiff must not only show that a news outlet published false information, but as the New York Times writes, that it did so knowing that the information was false or with substantial doubts about its accuracy. So it's unlikely that George Stephanopoulos was sitting here speaking about liability for rape in a manner that was intended to defame. That being said, there's this quote from Ron Nell Anderson Jones in the New York Times that I think is instructive. It's worth considering here as we wind down this show. Major news organizations have often been very leery of settlements in defamation suits brought by public officials and public figures, both because they fear the dangerous pattern of doing so and because they have the full weight of the First Amendment on their side. What we might be seeing here is an attitudinal shift compared to the mainstream American press of a decade ago. Today's press is far less financially robust, far more politically threatened, and exponentially less confident that a given jury will value press freedom rather than embrace a vilification of it. And this comes from Ron Nell Anderson Jones, a professor of law at the University of Utah. I'll end with the call to action that was put out by some colleagues of mine over at Truth Out that would like to just lay down a marker. And I think this is a kind of marker that is important at this time to set a standard for what we all are going to do. And some of it's going to be easier than others. Some people are going to find that they're in newsrooms where it's tremendously difficult to hold to principles, especially when you've got kind of a billionaire owner that is dictating from on high that you're not going to care. You're not going to pay lip service to democracy dying in the darkness anymore. You're just going to tell stories now. You're going to tell stories to people, all types of people. Tell stories to people who live in middle America. Tell stories to people who live on the coasts. Stories to people who live up north. Stories to people who live down south. You're going to try to appeal to all people, and you're not going to make democracy a central issue, even though, we know that in some ways you didn't always do the best job of making that the thing that you focused on in your publication. But that being said, you're not even going to pretend to try and warn people of the threats. When we think of the various outlets that are recalibrating and thinking that they don't want the second term to be as acrimonious as it was for them during the first term, what stands in contrast are the words of people at alternative media outlets or people working in movement media settings that are committed to holding to principles. according to Maya Shenwar, Negan Oalahi, and Ziggy West Jeffrey over at Truth Out, you have independent media organizations that are faced with urgent mandates. Tell the truth more loudly than ever before. Do that work even as our standard modes of distribution, such as social media platforms, are being manipulated and curtailed by forces of fascist repression and ruthless capitalism. Do that work even as journalism and journalists face targeted attacks, including from the government itself, and do that work in a community, never forgetting that we're not shouting into a faceless void. We're reaching out to real people amid a life-threatening political climate. Our task is formidable, and it requires us to ground ourselves in our principles, remind ourselves of our utility, dig in, and commit. So I dig in and commit. I stand with other people who are digging in at this moment. And I have credibility. I have a credibility. This show has credibility. The Dissenter Newsletter has credibility. And the people who I surround myself with and invite to contribute to the Dissenter have credibility. We have called out what Joe Biden did, and we will use what we have learned about Joe Biden, and we will go forward and we will apply that same standard to Donald Trump. And we didn't just cover Donald Trump and then let Biden enter office and ignore the threats that were posed to journalists and the threats that were posed to whistleblowers and the abuses of secrecy that meant that we were no longer getting the truth from government. We didn't shrug and say, let's go take a vacation. We dodged one. Donald Trump was not reelected because we knew that there was always a potential for those very things that threaten these rights to return. And we didn't get much of a break, especially since the prosecution against Julian Assange continued. Biden didn't withdraw that prosecution. And also because of a whole array of issues that you could read about in the Biden's legacy series that I wrote about for the Dissenter. So I don't need to rehash that material. Thank you for being here to follow this first edition of the Dissenter Weekly. Next week, we'll have another episode. The main story will be to get into Asif Rahman and his pleading guilty to this Espionage Act charge, because there's no trial, but there will be a sentencing in May. And so this will be the first sentencing of an Espionage Act defendant under President Donald Trump. So it's a remarkable example of how people will be made an example, how people will be punished for truth telling. We'll get to see. I'm sure that they'll probably try and stretch the limit of what they can get as far as a lengthy prison sentence. So with that, I thank you for being here to tune into this show. I thank all of you who are supporters and contributors. I thank anybody who in this moment chips in a few dollars here or there to make independent journalism a reality, because there's journalism out there that is degraded and doesn't quite grasp the urgency and the matters that are most pressing. And then there's journalism by people who are dedicated and committed to this work and are willing to give and sacrifice themselves. I think people who watch this show can tell the difference between somebody who's just doing it because it's their job and those people who actually live it and breathe it every day and feel that it's important to stand up for particular issues. So I thank you for being there, and I thank you for being here with me to watch this show. And I'll be back next week with another edition of